Okay, so I am doing Check Your Understanding 12.1, and in this, and I'm going to start with 1A, which asks you to consider the change in the aggregate demand curve as a result of a rise in the interest rate caused by a change in monetary policy. So my first step is I am going to just simply set up my aggregate, what is right now my aggregate demand model. So here I have on the horizontal axis, I have quantity of output, quantity of output, which we measure by real GDP. And remember, we're denoting quantity of output as Y. And then on the vertical axis, I have the price level, which I am going to denote with P. And remember how we measure it? We measure it with the GDP deflator. And I am going to first start with my aggregate demand curve. So it looks like this. It's sloping downward from left to right. So this is going to be AD sub 1. Okay. And it's useful to consider, to start with a hypothetical point on this aggregate demand curve that corresponds to a quantity of output, which I'll call Y1, and a certain price level, which I'll call P sub 1. Now the question says, okay, a rise in the interest rate caused by a change in monetary policy. Now, first of all, we need to ask, are we talking about a movement along the aggregate demand curve? Or are we talking about a shift of the curve? Well, we only move along the aggregate demand curve when the change is a change in the price level. In this problem, there has been no change in the price level. The price level is staying at P sub 1. The only thing that has changed is the interest rate. So here we are talking about a shift. And if you look at the chart that describes the factors that shift aggregate demand, change in the interest rate is one of them. So we're definitely talking about a shift. So that's number one thing to consider. Then we have to ask ourselves, all right, are we talking about a shift to the right, meaning an increase in aggregate demand, or are we talking about a shift to the left, meaning a decrease of aggregate demand? So now we have to think about the kind of the nuts and bolts of how aggregate demand might change as a result of a rise in the interest rate. Well, when interest rates rise, it becomes more difficult to borrow money for firms and for consumers. Remember, the interest rate is the price of money. So when you go to the bank and you say, I want to borrow this amount of money, the bank will say you may, but you will have to pay a certain interest rate. And so we call the interest rate the price of money. Now, if it's money that allows us to demand stuff, and the price of this stuff, the price of what allows us to buy stuff increases, then we are not going to have the money to buy stuff. So our aggregate demand will decrease. So at this same price level, we are now going to move to the left. Our aggregate demand, we know it's a shift, but it's going to shift to the left. And so we're going to have a new aggregate demand curve that looks like that. And I'm going to call this AD sub 2. So I'm going to shift to the left. I'm still at the same price level. So I've shifted to this new point on a new aggregate demand curve. And if I want to consider what's happened to my aggregate output, Y as a result, then I can consider that I've dropped down to the horizontal axis here to Y sub 2. And what I can see clearly is that I have experienced a decrease in aggregate demand. So that is part A. So in part B, then, the problem asks you to consider a fall in the real value of money in the economy due to a higher aggregate price level. So if I want to graph this, again, I'm going to start with my aggregate demand and aggregate supply model, even though all I'm doing right now is graphing aggregate demand. So here on the horizontal axis, I have the quantity of output, of my economy's output, that I measure using real GDP. And I denote this with as Y. And on the vertical axis, I have the price level, which I denote with P. And here I'm going to use the GDP deflator. That's going to tell me what the price level is in my economy. I'm going to automatically graph a hypothetical aggregate demand curve, which slopes downward from left to right. And I'm going to call this AD sub 1. And I'm going to pick a hypothetical point on my aggregate demand curve. So let's say that we begin, let's just pick this point. And I'm going to say that this corresponds to a specific price level, the price level we start at, so I'm going to call that P sub 1, and a specific quantity of output of real GDP. So I'm going to call this on the horizontal axis Y sub 1. Now the question says that our economy sees a fall in the real value of money in the economy due to a higher aggregate price level. So essentially, our price level has increased from P sub 1 to a new price level that I'm going to call P sub 2. Okay? And now my first question has to be, considering my aggregate demand curve, am I moving along the aggregate demand curve or am I shifting the curve? Well, remember that if the reason for a change is a change in the price level in our economy, then we are talking about a movement. If it's anything else, then we're talking about a shift. So here in this problem, we are in fact talking about a change due to a higher aggregate price level. And for that reason, we are talking about a movement along our aggregate demand curve. Okay, so we are going to move now along the curve to this new price level. So we're going to move here. Okay, and if we wanted to look at how this changes the quantity of output demanded, well, I can simply come down to my horizontal axis and plot this new point on the horizontal axis, which is Y sub 2. And what I can clearly see is that my aggregate output has decreased. This makes sense. And think of it intuitively. Our dollar essentially does not buy as much as it used to buy. That's what it means when it says there's a fall in the real value of the dollar. So in that case, people are incentivized then to hold on to their dollars. They're going to save instead of spend. And this is intuitive. If you consider that your dollar used to be able to buy you a pack of gum, and then you turn around and your dollar now cannot even buy you, like a 25-cent, what used to be a 25-cent piece of candy, then you're less likely to want to spend that dollar. So that's what it means for our quantity of output to decrease as a result of an increase in the price level. The value of our dollar has decreased. We can buy less with our dollar, meaning we're more likely to hold on to it and not spend it. In part C, the problem asks you to consider the change of news of a worse than expected job market next year. Okay, so before I even start to consider the dynamics, I'm going to draw my aggregate demand and aggregate supply model. Okay, so I have on my horizontal axis, I have quantity of output, which I'm going to measure using real GDP, and I denote this with Y. And then on my vertical axis, I'm going to have the price level, which I denote with P, and I'm going to measure using the GDP deflator. Okay, I'm going to start with a hypothetical aggregate demand curve, which I'm going to call AD sub 1, the first aggregate demand curve. And then I'm going to just pick a hypothetical point on this aggregate demand curve that corresponds to a certain price level, which I'm going to call P sub 1, and a certain quantity of output, which I'm going to call Y sub 1. Okay, now I'm going to consider what happens when there's news of a worse than expected job market next year. Well, first I need to ask, is this a shift or is this a movement of the aggregate demand curve? Remember that if we're talking about a movement, we only move along the aggregate demand curve when the reason for a change is that there's been a change in the aggregate price level. That is not the case here. Nothing has happened to prices. Something else has happened. That is the reason for the change. And as a result, we're talking about a shift of the aggregate demand curve. Our next question then has to be, okay, well, if we're shifting the aggregate demand curve, are we shifting it to the right, meaning aggregate demand has increased, or are we shifting it to the left, meaning aggregate demand has decreased? Now, you can check your chart that describes the factors that shift aggregate demand, but we can also think about this just intuitively, because this falls in the realm of expectations. And consider how you would change your demand for goods in our economy if you thought that the job market wasn't going to be doing well next year. If you thought your prospects for a job next year were either going to become unsteady or were going to get worse, I think it's reasonable to think that you would try to save the money you have now. If you're not optimistic about what the job market is going to be, you are more likely to hold on to your money than to spend it. And so what's going to happen to our aggregate demand curve as a result of this of not a lack of optimism for the future is that demand is going to decrease. Aggregate demand is going to decrease. So we're going to go from this point on the aggregate demand curve and we're going to shift to the left. Remember, nothing has happened to prices. Okay, so we're going to shift to the left. And that shift is going to justify a new aggregate demand curve. At every price, at price level, we are demanding less. That's going to be AD sub 2. And this new point corresponds to that same price level, but to a different quantity of aggregate demand. And that's a quantity that's Y sub 2. And comparing the two, Y sub 1 and Y sub 2, we see that we've decreased our demand. In Part D, the problem asks you to consider a fall in tax rates. So before I even start to consider this, I am going to draw my aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. And I'm going to start calling this the ADAS model, just so I don't have to keep saying aggregate demand and aggregate supply. The ADAS model. Okay, so I'm being methodical here in how I set this up because I really want to drill this into you, that this is how we think about this. So on the horizontal axis, I have quantity of output, which I denote with Y, and I measure using real GDP. On the vertical axis, I have the price level, which I denote with P, and measure using the GDP deflator. Okay, first things first, I'm going to draw a hypothetical aggregate demand curve. This is AD sub 1. I'm going to pick a point on this aggregate demand curve just to consider where I begin. And this corresponds with a quantity of aggregate demand, which I'm going to call Y sub 1, and it corresponds to a level of prices in our economy, which I'm going to call P sub 1. Now I'm going to consider the question, a fall in tax rates. And I first need to decide, is this a shift or is this a movement? Well, the only time we move along the aggregate demand curve is when there's a change in the price level. That is not what's happening in this case. We have something other than a change in the price level that's affecting aggregate demand. So as a result, I know automatically that I'm thinking about a shift in aggregate demand. Once I know it's a shift, I have to think about which way I'm shifting. Am I shifting to the right, meaning that aggregate demand is increasing? Or am I shifting to the left, meaning that aggregate demand is decreasing? Well, let me consider a fall in tax rates. I'm going to add a little detail to this question because I actually think that it makes a difference who we are cutting, whose taxes we are cutting. If we're cutting the taxes of wealthy individuals, I think it's much less likely, and the data shows us it's much less likely, that they are going to go out and spend it in the economy. If, however, these tax rates were applied to, say, the middle class or those earning below a middle class level threshold, then I think we would be more likely to see an increase in demand because people who are making less are more likely to take the money that that they would earn from a fall in the tax rate and go and spend it in the economy. So I'm going to make my own, so Miriam's assumption in this problem is we're cutting taxes of middle class and below, okay? So if that happens, then I think we would see an increase in aggregate demand because what we would see is that people, if the tax rates fall, they don't have to pay as much in taxes. And if they don't have to pay as much in taxes and don't have to give that money to the government, then those people will take that money and go and spend it in the economy. Okay, and I'm also going to assume, I'm going to make a second assumption here. So one, that's the second assumption is that the money that they were paying in taxes, the government wasn't going to spend. Because if the government spends it, then that also shifts aggregate demand, and so you might not see any difference. But, so we're going to make two assumptions here. We're going to say we're going to cut taxes of the middle class or people who are falling below that threshold, and we're going to assume that the government isn't going to spend the money that they would have given to the government. So if that's the case, then I think you would see from this point here on my hypothetical aggregate demand curve, we'd see an increase in aggregate demand. People would take the money that they saved from not having to pay taxes and they would go out into our economy, into our markets, and they would spend it, raising aggregate demand. So this would be, we said this is a shift. So this is a shift of the aggregate demand curve. So this is AD sub 2. And if I wanted to think about how this changed the quantity of output, well, I could come down and list my new output level, which is Y sub 2. And I'm not going to change my price level because price levels haven't changed. So all that I see is an increase in the quantity of output that is demanded by a number of different factors in our economy. Okay, so aggregate demand increases. Part 1E asks you to consider the effect on aggregate demand of an increase in the real value of assets in the economy due to a lower price level. So again, before I even consider the dynamics here, I'm going to set up my ADAS model, my aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. So I have on my horizontal axis, I have quantity of output, which I denote by Y, and I measure using real GDP. On my vertical axis, I have the price level, which I denote with a P, and I measure using the GDP deflator. Okay. I'm going to draw a hypothetical aggregate demand curve. So this is AD sub 1, the first one. And I'm going to pick a point just to help me visualize and think about where we begin. So this point, I'm going to say, corresponds to a certain level of output of our economy that I'm going to call Y sub 1, and that we demand that level of output at a certain price level, so P sub 1. Okay, And now let me consider what will happen as a result of an increase in the real value of assets in the economy due to a lower price level. So the problem is telling me here that the reason that I need to consider this change in aggregate demand is because of a change in the price level. The price level has decreased, and I'm going to say it's decreased to a new price level, which I'm going to call P sub 2. Okay, so now I need to consider, am I moving along the demand curve, aggregate demand curve, or am I shifting the entire thing? Remember that when the reason for a change in my aggregate demand is a change in the price level, then I am talking about a movement along the aggregate demand curve. If it's for any other reason, I'm talking about a shift. So here I am exactly talking about a change in the price level. It's decreased. And so what I'm going to have here is a movement along the aggregate demand curve. Okay, the first one. So what's going to happen is as my price level decreases, okay, as prices lower in my economy, I am going to move along the aggregate demand curve to a new point that corresponds with this lower level of prices, okay? And if I think about, the quantity of output that corresponds to this new price level, all I have to do is come down to the horizontal axis and label it Y sub 2. And what I can see is that comparing Y sub 1 and Y sub 2, I see that my aggregate demand has increased. Now, this makes sense. It's intuitive. Consider what might happen when the dollar is able to purchase more. If all of a sudden you went from being able to buy a house for, say, $100,000 to being able to buy a house for $20,000, it's much more likely that you're going to enter into the market and actually make that purchase. And everyone is going to do that. So we're going to see a general increase in the quantity of output that it's demanded, not just by consumers, but also investors. The prices decrease and people demand, not just people, but also firms demand more. In part F, the question asks you to consider a change in aggregate demand that happens as a result of the rise in the real value of assets due to a surge in real estate values. Okay, so essentially they're asking you to consider what happens to aggregate demand as a result of what happened to us right before the Great Recession. So before I consider the dynamics here, let me, as usual, set up my ADAS model. Aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. Right now I'm only considering demand though, but at some point we're going to think about both of those things on the same graph. So on my horizontal axis I have the quantity of output that I denote with Y, and I'm going to measure using real GDP. And then on my vertical axis I have the price level, I denote with P, that I am going to measure using the GDP deflator. That exactly tells us what the price level is in our economy. I'm going to graph a hypothetical aggregate demand curve that I'm going to call AD sub 1. And I'm going to pick a point on this aggregate demand curve that's going to help me kind of think about our changes that are happening. And this point corresponds to a certain level of prices in our economy, which I'm going to call P sub 1. And it's going to correspond to a certain level of quantity of output that's demanded in our economy, Y sub 1. Remember, I'm making it Y sub 1 because at some point we're going to be, you've already seen, for instance, in cases where I shift the demand curve, that I'm calling something P sub 2. It's the second price or the second output demanded. So we're just going to keep that consistent. And then let's consider now whether we are talking about a change that results in a movement along the aggregate demand curve, or a shift of the aggregate demand curve. So remember that when we are moving along the aggregate demand curve, we only move along it when the change that we're moving for is a change in the price level. When the price levels change, then we move along the aggregate demand curve. If our reason for having to think about what happens to the aggregate demand curve is for any other reason other than the price level, we are talking about a shift in the demand curve. So in this case, I am talking about a rise in the real value of assets, but it's not because the general price level in the economy has decreased. Remember, in the last problem, we saw the general price level in our economy decreased, which meant that our dollar could buy a lot more stuff. So we were showing a movement along the aggregate demand curve because the reason why our assets rose, the value of our assets rose, was because of a decrease in the price level. Here, that is not why our assets have risen in value. Our assets have risen in value because of a very specific market where the values have increased, and that's the real estate market. So first of all, because we are not changing as a result of the change in the price level, this represents a shift of my demand curve, okay? Now I have to consider, am I shifting to the right, meaning aggregate demand has increased, or am I shifting to the left, meaning aggregate demand has decreased? So let me think about this, and let me give you the real world scenario, and one that happened not so long ago. If, let's say that in a very quick amount of time, people consider the value of the homes that they live in. So, maybe they lived in a house where in, say, 2000, it was worth, I don't know, say $120,000 on the market. And then within a span of, say, I don't know, a few years, say by 2005, that home now is worth $260,000. One of the things they can do is go to the bank and borrow money against the value of their home. They can use their home as collateral. So they can basically go to the bank and say, hey, bank, I want to borrow 200 and whatever their home is worth now, so maybe $220,000, and I'm going to put my home up as collateral. Now that money that they get from the bank is cash money. This is money they can take to the market and spend. So when the rise in the real value of assets comes as a result of the surge in real estate values, we should see an increase in aggregate demand. People are able to borrow more, the amount of money in the economy increases, and there's greater aggregate demand as a result. So from this first point here, this point that I started at, what I would expect to see if the rise in the real value of assets, if a rise, say, in the purchasing power of the dollar comes as a result of an increase in the value of homes, I would expect to see a shift of my aggregate demand. Remember, price levels have not changed yet. They will eventually, but right now they have not. We're just seeing an initial surge in real estate values that's increasing the value of assets. So I'm going to see an increase in demand to a new point. Price levels have not changed. And because I'm talking about a shift, this point is actually on a whole new aggregate demand curve. I'm going to call that AD sub 2. And if I want to think about how the quantity of output has changed, I can simply come over to the horizontal axis and mark where it hits, and that as Y sub 2. And now when I compare Y sub 1 and Y sub 2, I can see that my quantity of output demanded has increased. I hope number 1 makes sense. If it does not, please come and see me during office hours.